right. Hi, folks, and welcome back to Workday Innovators Dojo, aka the WID podcast. I'm your host, Peter Shepard. I've been active in the Workday ecosystem since 2014 as a certified implementer, an independent consultant, and a Workday customer. I'm here talking to the experts in the field to share their insights with you on all things Workday. With me today, I have Patrick Fink, certified integration specialist, who's here to talk to us about Workday's API capabilities. Pat, great to have you on the program today. Do you mind giving us a little introduction on yourself?
Sure thing. Really excited to be here, Peter. A little about me. I'm currently a Workday Integrations Administrator at CHG Healthcare. We specialize in locum tenens healthcare staffing to help facilities fill staffing gaps. I myself have been in the Workday ecosystem for going on 9 years, where I've been on both the consulting and customer sides, obtaining Workday certifications in Integration Studio and Core Connector for third-party payroll.
Excellent. Awesome. Thanks so much, Pat. So I guess let's start with the basics. What is an API and why is that important to us in the world of Workday?
Sure. So API stands for Application Programming Interface, which, if you ask me, is about the least meaningful technical term I can think of.
Yeah, not much to go on there. Maybe you could give us a little bit of context on what a application programming interface actually is, especially for the non-technical folks that we might have on the audience.
Sure. So the real word analogy I like to use to explain an API is an ATM.
Like a cash machine ATM?
Exactly. Believe it or not, there's a lot of similarities. So when you go to an ATM, what's the first thing you have to do?
Put in my card and I guess I punch in my PIN.
Correct. So now we go into the world of APIs. We'd call this authenticating. But it's really similar to what you've done at your ATM. You've presented your credential, which for the ATM is your card. For an API, it might be a username or a token of some kind. You've then provided a password which matches your credential. The API at this point has confidence in who you are, and you're then allowed to access the system.
Okay, right. So now I can kind of get, check my bank balance, get cash, deposit checks, things like that.
Correct. The ATM, now that it knows who you are, will offer different types of transactions or functions depending on what services you have at your bank. The API works the same way. Depending on who you are and the security you have, you can push different types of transactions in or out of Workday.
Okay. So then I guess I'm trying to understand how are these APIs useful? Like as an end user of Workday, I'm not typically using an API to interact with Workday, right?
Correct. The API is designed for system-to-system communication, not to support regular end users. So if we go back to the acronym Application Programming Interface, meaning allowing different applications to communicate with one another, what they really meant to do is load data to Workday or extract data from Workday via other systems or automation.
Okay, that makes sense. And so with this API, what kinds of things can I do, systematically in Workday?
Well, the API in Workday is quite extensive. There are web services to cover every functional area of Workday and more or less mirror any activity that an end user can do.
Okay, so you slipped another technical term in there, web service. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So going back to the ATM analogy, you can think of a web service as an individual activity that you can do within the API. So checking your bank balance might be a web service. Depositing cash is a separate web service. Within Workday, you can think of different things like hiring a worker, changing a worker's job, retrieving a worker's demographic information. Each of those has its own web service.
Okay, I see. So I guess what I'm picturing is there's quite a few web services out there, given how large a system Workday is. Can you give us some insight into, how these might be organized? Like, let's say I'm trying to build an integration from a third-party system to hire a worker into Workday. Like, where do I start?
It's a great question. So for starters, Workday's API documentation is available online and is easily found through a quick Google search. You don't even need a community account to access it. Once you've gotten to the documentation, you'll see that it's organized by service, which roughly equates to functional area. Now, for something like hire, you'd want to look into the staffing service for what web service options might exist.
Okay. So you said something interesting just now that I want to hone in on. So you said options as in plural. So does that mean I might have multiple web services to choose from?
Exactly right. Depending on what use case you're trying to address, you may have one or many web services to choose from.
So that's interesting. So how would I figure out, or how would I go about, determining which web service would suit my needs the best?
As a broad rule, I try to find the web service that is most specific to the use case I'm trying to meet.
Okay. So I guess I'm having a hard time picturing what you mean. Can you give an example by that?
Sure. Let's say I'm trying to load a compensation change for a single worker. I could use a web service like Change Job, which has options for a compensation change. But it's also built to leverage things like promotions, lateral moves, demotions, union membership changes, and other transaction types. Instead, a better choice would be to use the request compensation change web service, which is purpose built strictly to update compensation.
I see. And that selection of one web service versus another, what difference does it really make? If I choose one, I mean, both seem to be able to accomplish the things I'm trying to make. Like what's the difference really?
Another great question. Um, and really, there are two reasons. The first is functional. You have to keep in mind that any transaction you're pushing into Workday will ultimately be reportable and referenceable within the system. So, going back to our comp change example, what would make more sense to see on that worker's profile? A job change for every time their compensation was changed, or a compensation event?
Okay. Yeah. All right. I see what you mean. And I would say, yeah, that the comp change event is maybe more accurate for that type of transaction.
I would too. Now, it's always worth pulling in the stakeholders for these processes to get their buy-in for these kinds of design decisions. But I think in this case, the consensus would be a comp change makes more sense.
Got it. Yeah, I think so too. And you alluded to a second reason, what that might be for selecting the most specific web service.
The second is security. You want to keep in mind that by granting access to a web service, you're essentially allowing that credential to transact directly into Workday. Most security professionals encourage what is called least privilege when granting this kind of system access, meaning the credential should have the absolute minimum security permissions to do its job and nothing more. Selecting the most specific web service to your use case and then granting access to only that web service would be part of enforcing least privileges.
Got it. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'm glad you brought up the concept of least privileges. Is that leads me to another question. So, so far we've talked through mainly Workday inbound web services, but we also have a series of outbound web services as well, right?
Correct.
Okay. And my understanding is those are used to basically expose data to another system for consumption, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So my question is, do I have the ability to limit what fields and data get exposed via an outbound web service?
Another great question. And best answer I have for you is sort of.
Okay. So how do we sort of limit the output of one of these outbound web services?
So there are a few layers of security available to us, and most cases meet the need to limit the data exposed. The first layer is at the web service level, meaning I grant a credential access to one or more web services and exclude it from all the rest. So
Mhm.
let's say I expose the get preferred name web service, allowing the credential to pull someone's preferred name, but I exclude the credential from all other web services. So it wouldn't have the ability to pull their government IDs or other PII.
Okay, that makes sense. And what other options are there?
Well, using domain security, I can also limit what fields are exposed within a web service call. But this is where things get somewhat tricky.
And why is that?
Well, the issue is security domains, by definition, encapsulate a group of fields and data, meaning I may not have access to achieve precisely least privileges depending on the use case and domain setup.
So I guess I'm having a hard time picturing that. Like, can you break us down a little bit and maybe give us an example?
Sure. So going back to our get preferred name web service, which again is meant to expose the preferred name of a worker or set of workers. Now, the domain we would use to access the fields in question is called person data preferred name. The domain basically contains two fields, the worker's preferred first name and last name. So let's say that my requirement was to only expose the preferred first name, but not expose the preferred last name. Based on the domain setup in Workday, I wouldn't have the ability to withhold the last name as the domain is not that granular.
Okay, I see. And I guess there's probably not a get preferred first name web service for us, is there?
There is not.
So is that it? I just have to expose more data than is really needed to that third party system?
No, thankfully, we have additional options beyond the Workday public API,
Okay, and what are those?
namely reporting as a service or RAS, which thankfully Workday makes really easy to set up and administer.
Okay, and help me understand, like, what does that really look like? What does that entail?
Well, RAS is basically the concept of creating a custom report, which within Workday would be an advanced report, and then allowing that report to be called by a third party, thereby exposing that Workday data via that report.
Okay, I see. And I take it since we're building the report ourselves, we can control exactly what fields are exposed, right?
Exactly right. So going back to our preferred name example, we can build a custom report that just exposes the preferred name of the worker population. So now we're only granting the consuming system access to that exact field or set of data that it needs.
I see. And help me understand, like, what format is that data available in if we expose a report as a RAS, knowing that the public API, I think, is XML based.
Again, Workday makes it really easy where we have several formats to choose from out of the box. Currently, Workday RAS supports XML, JSON, CSV, and RSS.
Okay, very cool. So let me ask you, so when exposing data to a third party, why wouldn't I just build a RAS report every time? Like, what's the point of using the public web service if I can just build a report instead?
So you certainly could, but it's important to think of the technical debt being created each time a RAS report is turned on. It means someone needs to keep track of that RAS being used, what credential has access to it, and what system is calling the report. You also need controls in place to ensure that no one is inadvertently changing that report, as that would interfere with the data pull.
Gotcha. So I suppose the public web services, since they're maintained by Workday, are a little more hands off to manage.
Correct. You still need to keep track of the credential and what it is access to, but otherwise, we can be pretty confident that the web service is going to remain intact and functioning, as you said, Workday is managing.
Okay. So if I'm following, the best case for us is to use a Workday web service if it fits my needs, and to try to limit using RAS to cases where the public web service just doesn't quite fit the requirements. Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. So what if one of the public web services is missing a field that I need? Do I have any options on the public web services, to expose an additional field, or do I necessarily have to build a RAS in that case?
That's a great question. We do have the ability to extend public web services with what is called a field override service. And keep in mind, this feature is not available on all web services, but for many, we're able to include additional fields via the field override service that are not on the web service straight out of the box.
Got it. And so for our listeners, how would they know that a given web service can use a field override service?
Again, so we're going to go back to the Workday documentation. I find the easiest way to search is to search the documentation for words provider reference. That will usually highlight the part of the web service where a field override service can be referenced.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. So, I guess changing gears a little bit. So Workday, as we all know, is continually evolving. New features come online, even new functional areas from time to time. Can you talk to me a little bit about how web services might change as we move through time?
Sure, and that's a great call out. Similarly to how the Workday application has semi-annual releases, so does the Library of Web Services. Workday does an excellent job of detailing these during each preview window, so we usually have a feel for what is coming. Namely, what new web services are being brought online and what tweaks may be available for existing web services.
Okay, I see. And so with these releases, does that mean I have to use the latest version of the web service each time Workday is updated? Like I could see that being a pretty heavy lift to keep updated every 6 months, right?
Yeah, that would be a lot to manage. And thankfully, the answer is no. If you review the web service documentation, you'll notice that each time a web service is called, you have to specify which version of the web service you are calling. So as long as you leave the version number in place, that call will continue to function the same as it did when you went live, meaning you're not forced to change to the latest version.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. And for our listeners, is there anything security wise they should be thinking about when using the API?
Well, we talked a little about domain security already, but you'll want to be mindful about the authentication setup when enabling this kind of connectivity.
How so?
Well, two things offhand. First, thinking about how often you want to force a password reset for the credential. Maybe you want it to reset annually, or maybe never force a reset. There's not necessarily a right answer here, but something to be mindful about so that the consuming system and your Workday administrators properly coordinate for a new password, whatever the cadence is.
Okay, that makes sense. And number two?
Two is setting up the authentication policy for that credential so it is secure as possible, meaning using IP whitelisting if possible, which I think you may have talked about on an earlier episode.
That's right. Yeah, we talked about on episode 1 when we discussed all things authentication. We did talk about using whitelisting. So for our listeners, I'd recommend jumping back to that episode if you have questions about options there. I think that's about all the time that we have for today. Pat, my friend, thank you so much for coming on and talking us through the Workday API. Lots of great information here. As always, thank you to our audience for tuning in. If you found the show useful, do us a big favor and give us a thumbs up and subscribe wherever you happen to find our podcast. And if you have an idea for a future episode or a topic that you'd want to see, please drop us a comment. I'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to have whatever you're asking for on the show. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next time on Workday Innovators Dojo.